land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream water, this land was made for you and me. This land is your land, this land is my land.
In 1919, at a Chamber of Commerce luncheon, Kewanee Boiler Company President E.E. Baker offered a gift of $50,000 for purchasing and improving parks and playgrounds. As a result, the Kewanee Park District was formed. The first parks planned were the new Northeast Park, the new Liberty Park, the newly acquired Chautauqua Park, and the new Valley Park, later renamed Baker Park. But Kewanee had numerous beautiful parks long before the Park District was formed. So here's a brief overview of many of Kewanee's parks over the years.
This land was made for you and me.
As we know, the Wethersfield colony was founded in 1836. The next year, the first settlers surveyed the land for a village and filed the plat. It included plans for a public square around which businesses could be located, but it was dry when the pioneers laid out the square. They soon found, however, that during the better part of the year, the square filled with ponds of water. Geese enjoyed the ponds so much that the area was often referred to as Goose Island. Later, when businesses began to develop in the village, they were built on the drier ground along McClure Street to the west of Tenney Street. The commons became badly scarred by ruts from the wheels of the wagons parked in and around the wetlands. There were no trees, simply a flat, often wet, square of land. Farmers grazed their livestock on the commons. But in 1901, that changed when Wethersfield outgrew its schools and the Board of Education began discussing its options. In 1902, the board accepted a proposal for it to acquire the commons and build a new school there. The Bliss School opened in 1903 with Frank H. Craig as the superintendent. Craig wanted it to be so much more than a school. The school was placed in the middle of the 10 acres, and Craig oversaw beautifying the grounds. Originally, 286 trees were planted, and numerous flower beds were added. It soon attracted birds, bees, and people. There was a playground, a baseball diamond, several football fields, croquet grounds, and a tennis court. While students were the primary beneficiaries, the community learned to enjoy it too. Proudly, Craig wrote to the state school superintendent touting the beauty and virtues of the changed commons, and the community was equally proud of this new use of the public square. The commons in the village of Wethersfield had finally become what the original pioneer settlers had envisioned. Now let's move on to Kewanee's first park, what we call today West Park. It was created within the first year after our hometown's founding. Before the founding of Kewanee, James Elliott owned the southwest quarter of Section 33 in what became Kewanee Township, bordered by today's Beach, Main, and Division Streets and Central Boulevard. The land was in the southeastern edge of Big Barren Grove, the majestic woods 6 miles wide and running from the northwestern tip of Wethersfield Township to the northeast for 15 miles. After the village was founded in 1854, a gently rolling, wooded 5-acre plot on Elliott's land began being used as a park. In the spring of 1856, J.H. Howe, R.A. Tenney, and 2 other men reached agreement with Elliott to acquire and develop about 60 acres of his quarter section. They included plans for a formal park in the plat they filed with the county. The men then began selling lots around the park and featuring the park in their advertisements. The village eventually acquired the park, and it became an integral part of life in Kewanee, where friends, families, church and civic organizations, and small and large groups all met for various outdoor activities. For instance, in September 1856, the park saw its largest crowd up to that time when the newly formed Republican Party of Henry County and adjacent counties held their convention in Kewanee. An estimated 8,000 to 10,000 people attended, and the park was used for orations and other activities. In another example, in 1857, the park was used for the annual celebration of the 4th of July. And after the Civil War commenced and Kewanee formed 2 companies of Civil War soldiers, the park served as a gathering place to honor those going off to war. John H. Howe, later Kewanee's only Civil War general, built his family's house just a block from the park he helped develop. But by 1870, the park had fallen into some disrepair. The newspaper reported that, for years, the park has been allowed to run to common. Fence was broken down and carried off piecemeal, and an Eastern man had actually set up a claim to the property. But the paper then rejoiced that the new village trustees were taking steps to clear up the title, put up a new fence, clearing out the overgrown brush and trimming trees. And the paper reported it now presents a very different appearance from what it did formerly. Later in the decade, in response to calls for more improvements, the trustees acted. In 1876, the city put in a bandstand and seating. In 1877, the city called out old and dying trees and planted new trees, but it left some open spaces as well. But by 1910, once again, shrubs were overgrowing the park, the bandstand was becoming dilapidated, and so plans were made to upgrade the park. Diagonal walkways and a fountain where they met were planned. They trimmed trees, they removed overgrown shrubs and added ornamental planting. Soon a lagoon with a walking bridge was planned. Although work had begun on the excavation needed for the lagoon, dissension arose among the trustees and the lagoon idea was dropped. By 1911, Kewanee's first park regained its beauty and desirability as a place to gather. At the time, it was only known as either the Park or the Grove, not the West Park as we know it today. And that's because there was no need to identify the only park in town until the next park, East Park, came into being. In 1836, Colonel Sylvester Blish was one of the 3 men tasked to find and buy land for what became the Wethersfield colony. In 1837, Blish, his family, and other pioneers settled the colony. He became an important man within the community. In 1854, when the railroad bypassed Wethersfield a mile and a half to the north, Blish, along with 3 other men and later a 4th, acquired and platted the land, which eventually became downtown Kewanee. Blish held many positions of trust in both Wethersfield and the fledgling Kewanee, including serving as the first postmaster in each village. Unfortunately, before he could reap the fruit of his involvement in the founding of Kewanee, Blish died in 1855. The Blish family owned significant property in what became Wethersfield and Kewanee townships, including the northeast quarter of Section 33 in Kewanee Township. Some of that land became part of the village of Kewanee's original downtown. In 1857, the Blish family donated 2 pieces of land in Section 33, one for the original Kewanee Cemetery and one for a public square bounded by 2nd, 3rd, Walnut, and Vine Streets. The cemetery was immediately used, while the public square remained undeveloped, but that changed in the mid-1870s, and soon it became known as a park. The land was plowed and graded, then harrowed, rolled, and seeded with grass. The village planted a large number of trees throughout the park, along with a row of box elder trees along the park's entire perimeter. Walks covered with gravel were built. Lawn seating was scattered throughout the park. The old flagpole, which previously stood for years at 3rd and Tremont, was moved to East Park. In 1886, an iron fence was erected around the perimeter of the park. In 1887, a bandstand was built, and soon concerts were being held regularly. In 1891, city lighting was extended to the park. The park's improvements led to a high level of use of this new park. Over the years, the park continued to go through changes. One would think that Sylvester Blish and his family would have been pleased to see common sense prevail in his land used for multiple public purposes.
Come along with me.
Where to?
Down to to the old swimming hole.
When I think about a body of water in Wethersfield, I naturally think of Winmont Park. But before Winmont Park opened in 1906, there was another body of water in Wethersfield enjoyed by kids and adults alike. Its name, Merritt's Pond. The story of the pond begins and ends with Henry Clay Merritt. While in college back east, Merritt hunted partridges and began shipping them to a game merchant in New York City. Merritt moved to Henry County in the 1850s and to Kewanee in the 1860s. When he came west, he continued hunting, and then he began hiring other hunters to gather game, and he would ship them to New York and other large cities. Soon, Merritt became wealthy. He eventually owned valuable business blocks in Kewanee, as well as in Atkinson and in other villages. In 1878, Merritt purchased the old brewery in Wethersfield at the corner of Mill and Hollis Streets. Merritt converted it to an ice house for his burgeoning game business. To obtain ice, Merritt dammed the Spoon River, now Mill Creek, to form a small pond. In 1886, Merritt built a new 30 by 50-foot brick ice house and enlarged his pond by dredging and then by adding a new 200-foot brick dam. Wethersfield kids had jolly good times skating on the pond, with boys and girls flocking to the pond by the score. Kids swam in the pond in the summer, and dances were held at the pond as well. But by 1898, Merritt was finished with his ice business. The lake was drained, and it became a rubbish dump, finally closing in 1914. In September 1885, interested citizens met to perfect plans for an agricultural fair in Kewanee. In November, the newly formed Kewanee Fair Association purchased 28.5 acres of land and began work on a fairground. It was located to the east of the center of the growing village, just to the west of today's Kewanee High School campus. On Monday, September 27, 1886, the first Kewanee Fair opened. In time, it became the largest Illinois fair outside of Springfield, and the fair continued until the mid-1920s. Here we can see fairgoers watching races. And here are many Kewaneans and others enjoying activities in the Midway. In addition to the agricultural and related exhibits, racing was always an important component of the fair, and the fairground was used for racing at other times as well. Horse racing dominated the fair in its early years. In the 1890s, the bicycling craze hit Kewanee, and the fairground track hosted many a wheel race. Later, those newfangled horseless carriages found their way onto the fairground track. The first auto race likely was in 1914, culminating with the famous 1925 race. But the fairground offered so much more in the way of functional business, entertainment opportunities, civic events, and other sporting activities. In 1896, eventual three-time presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan stopped in Kewanee and spoke at the fairground during his first campaign against eventual winner William McKinley. The fairground was used year-round, not just during the fair, for livestock shows, sales, and auctions. It hosted important events and civic gatherings. For instance, the fairground hosted chautauquas, at which many spoke on a range of topics and otherwise entertained the thousands who could be accommodated. High school football was played at the fairground, both before and after it was played at Leggett Field. The fabled Kewanee Tornadoes played regularly at the fairground as well. Many other amateur teams of all ages played games there over the decades. The national pastime was played there. 1926 was the last year of the Great Kewanee Fair. The stockholders decided that characteristics of modern life had led to a decline in revenue that could no longer be borne. Sporting and other events continued there for the next decade, but in 1934, a Civil Works Administration grant was obtained to upgrade the athletic field in front of the old grandstand to be used for Kewanee High School athletic events. The first game played on the new gridiron was in 1936. In the same year, part of the fairground property was sold for housing development. By 1938, the present-day Kewanee High School Stadium was built on the old fairground site. In the late 1870s, Kewanee's paper wrote, "What a pity it is that there isn't a river or brook or lake or pond or puddle in or near Kewanee." But that was soon to change. The first lake in Kewanee became known as East Lake because it was east of downtown. It all came about because in 1879, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad needed a permanent source of water for its Kewanee depot. The CB&Q decided on building a dam across the west branch of the Spoon River to create a 40-acre reservoir with a depth of about 8 to 10 feet. It was east of the village and ran along what became Lake Street and by Fred C's Brewery, located where Bell Alexander School stands today. Charles K. Ladd, a prominent Kewanee attorney and known throughout Illinois, leased the land to the CB&Q. Ladd was a generous, public-spirited man, so he permitted skating and other recreational activities on his land. He built a boathouse, put up lighting, put in boats for public use, and just encouraged use of the lake and the park-like area adjacent to it. He often gave free use of the boats to civic groups. A hack line regularly carried lake-goers to and from downtown. In addition, guests at the Kewanee House were treated by the proprietor to a hack to the lake. In 1883, Ladd built the rustic pavilion at the lake and planted vines and climbing plants around it. Here's my guess as to the approximate location of East Lake Park and its lake, superimposed over a Google Earth Pro map. Only Lake Street and Floral Avenue existed at the time the park was created in 1879. Over the years, Lake Park became the place to go for boating, fishing, picnics, strolling, even fireworks offered by Mr. Ladd. And even after the dam broke in the late 1890s and the lake was permanently drained, the park's popularity continued, at least for a while. And we'll see soon how it was reborn only a few years later. At least as late as the mid-1840s, Native Americans camped for several weeks each winter along a small stream in an area about 2 miles west of what became downtown Kewanee to hunt venison and prairie chickens. It was referred to as Red Oak Hollow. By the 1890s, city folk took a liking to the area on the banks of the stream out west of town. The young men rode their wheels, bicycles, out to the area, but most were driven to the woods in hacks. The afternoon was spent picnicking and in different pastimes. The Kewanee Daily Star-Courier described it as one of the best places in the near vicinity for picnics. Long hills on each side give an air of seclusion and quiet to the place, which is not usually found so near a town. A creek courses through the grounds and keeps the atmosphere cooler than it would otherwise be. The ground is suitable for baseball, croquet, and other sports. It was also suitable for golf. The Kewanee Outing Club had been formed in the early 1890s to help organize tennis in the city. So the club took on organizing a golf club, and it chose Red Oak Hollow as the location. The club laid out the links in September 1896, and Kewanee Golf was born. The course was, well, course. Greens were nearly indistinguishable from fairways. The rocks and stones cleared from the course were piled and then covered with earth. Mounds called chocolate drops, the first hazards. Holes crossed each other, creating another hazard. But it was golf, and golf became a Kewanee passion. Within 2 years, other golf clubs and courses sprang up in Kewanee. But golf continued at Red Oak Hollow. Red Oak Hollow stopped being used at about the time Midland Country Club was developed, but Red Oak Hollow was the cradle of Kewanee golf. Crystal Lake Park opened in the summer of 1900, becoming Kewanee's first amusement park. How did it come about? Because Kewanee needed a reliable source of water. When Kewanee was founded in 1854, the only sources of water were private wells. Later, public wells were sunk, but primarily to provide a water source for fires. And then in 1887, a fire at the railroad depot convinced Kewaneans to build a water plant. The village began to search for a permanent water source. The village finally settled on an underground stream north of town. Work began on the waterworks, a dam, a reservoir, and laying pipe to the village. The village found that it could generate an income stream from letting out use of the lake and adjacent land. It became a source of block ice in the winter, and ice skaters enjoyed spinning around the lake. But then John P. Brady, all-round Kewanee raconteur, stepped up. Brady, who owned Brady's Saloon, today's Cerno's, ran popular Kewanee baseball teams. His father also had been a saloon owner in the same location. In 1900, the village granted the firm of Brady and Olson use of the Waterworks lake and grounds for an amusement park for a period of 5 years. By late summer, the newly named Crystal Lake Park was opened. The water chutes were the center of attraction, with 2 boats shooting the chutes into Crystal Lake. There was a dock for rowboats, a 60-foot high dive, and a bathing house. There was a refreshment stand and a merry-go-round, and there were many other means of separating patrons from their hard-earned dollars. Bands played on the nearby pavilion, picnics were regularly held on the grounds, and soon a ball field was laid out to the west of the power plant. In the winter, the chutes could be converted for toboggan use, and there was ice skating on the lake. The park was a success. But then things began changing in 1903. Streetcars were introduced to Kewanee. The streetcar company laid its tracks to East Lake Park, put in a new pavilion and other attractions, and built a ball field. The new park drew large crowds, and the Crystal Lake Amusement Park closed in due course, and even the ball field fence was moved to the new park, which was then renamed Terminal Park. In 1901, a railway company was organized and eventually became the Galesburg and Kewanee Electric Railway Company. Even after the East Lake Park Dam was destroyed and lake was only a wetland, the park was still heavily used. So the G&K announced plans to upgrade the park into a modern recreational area. The company also planned a streetcar barn and repair pit at the park. By early 1903, G&K began laying track to the old East Lake Park. And on August 23, 1903, the maiden voyage of the first streetcar took place from downtown to East Lake Park. Meanwhile, work continued on the recreational facilities at the park, soon renamed Terminal Park. John P. Brady leased the grounds at the park. He closed down his Crystal Lake Amusement Park and moved the Crystal Lake baseball field fence to the new Terminal Park ball field. The area where the former lake was located created a natural amphitheater with the ground rising to the west. Bleachers would be built to the south under the shade of the willow trees that had grown around the lake. In late 1903, a 44-foot by 100-foot pavilion/roller skating rink was completed. Kerosene lamps illuminated it for skating, but electric lighting was installed in February 1904. Brady purchased 125 pairs of wood-wheeled roller skates for use on the hardwood floors. On one end of the building, he built a stage for a variety of programs and events with seating for 800 people. Brady planned for a high wooden fence around the park for events requiring an admission fee. Baseball was especially popular, and the games played at Terminal Park generated significant traffic and revenue for both the streetcar company and Brady. It was so popular that the grandstand was replaced in 1906 by a new 90-foot-long grandstand erected behind home plate. Other seating was moved closer to the field and more bleachers were added. As a result, Kewanee was able to secure a minor league franchise in the Iowa League. The first league game for the Kewanee Boilermakers was played in the spring of 1908, but many amateur baseball teams played at the new diamond, and football was played there too. But in 1904, the G&K decided to build a car barn in Weathersfield, and it decided to build a new recreational park where it would also house the car barn. By 1906, Winmont Park was born. The streetcar company then moved the Terminal Park Pavilion to Winmont Park. But even without a pavilion, Terminal Park thrived. But after World War I and the formation of the Kewanee Park District, and after Northeast Park opened in 1922 and the other parks soon followed, those new parks supplanted Terminal Park. As a result, the streetcar company closed the section of its line along Lake Street between May and the park. Terminal Park was a destination no more. But if you find yourself today on Floral Avenue, just south of Lake Street, you can see the location of the entrance to Terminal Park, birthed by the streetcar. The Blish family had owned significant land in the Wethersfield colony and bleeding up into what became Kewanee Township. What I've marked as Blish Woods was a remnant of the southwestern tip of Big Barren Grove, the hardwood forest stretching for miles to the northeast. At least as early as the 1870s, the grove of trees was used as a picnic area, as evidenced by a story in the Kewanee Independent from 1873. Reporting on an otherwise spiritless 4th of July. In 1905, the Businessmen's Association of Kewanee announced a scheme for boosting Kewanee. It proposed purchasing 118 acres on the west end of Kewanee and Wethersfield, reserving a strip along the length of railroad tracks for businesses, platted otherwise for city lots, except for 9 acres reserved for a Chautauqua grounds in a beautiful grove of trees. Chautauqua Park was born. By 1907, the new park was being used for group outings with the convenience of the nearby Kewanee and Galva interurban railway stop at Pine Street. The Kewanee Daily Courier reported on the beauty of the park. It was our pleasure to look at some very beautiful scenery. The signs of approaching autumn were everywhere to be seen. The beautiful golden leaves were falling and the scent of the early fall flowers was floating on the soft breeze. Our attention was especially called to the many large and wide-sweeping walnut trees and to the bountiful crop of walnuts as they covered the ground where they had fallen from the stately trees. It was a sight not to be forgotten soon. When the Kewanee Park District was organized in 1919, the Park District took over responsibility for Chautauqua Park. By 1921, it had annexed the old park and almost tripled it in size. In 1922, the new Chautauqua Park was dedicated. On the dedication day, streetcars ran from downtown to Pine Street every 12 minutes from 2 p.m. until the end of the celebration. Chautauqua Park was reborn. In the 1920s, car camping became popular and camping sites called tourist camps were set up in Chautauqua Park. Oddly, I could find no evidence of Chautauqua public meetings held there. They must have been, but they must have been called something else. Nevertheless, Chautauqua Park was and is a beautiful park. That ends part 1 of my video on Kewanee parks. Please be sure to watch my video on these additional Kewanee parks. My book on the parks is available at the Kewanee Historical Society and on Amazon. If you purchase the book from the Historical Society, all of your money goes to the society. I also donated copies of the book to the Kewanee Public Library, so you can read it there as well. Thank you.